Flight 812, The Enigma of Runway 2. The story begins on the night of November 14th during a violent storm over the North Atlantic. At 3:14 a.m., the radar screens at Reykjavik's control center, which had been empty for hours, began to pulse. Flight 812, a charter plane declared missing 6 hours earlier, had reappeared out of thin air. The air traffic controllers were in shock. The plane hadn't just reappeared, it was at a perfect cruising altitude, even though calculations showed its fuel tanks should have been bone dry for at least 3 hours. The pilot's voice requesting permission to land was later described as eerily calm, as if he were reading from a manual, with no trace of panic or exhaustion after hours of being lost in the void. When the plane's wheels touched the wet Icelandic tarmac, not a single spark flew. The landing was mathematically perfect. The aircraft rolled to the end of the runway and stopped exactly in front of the control tower. The lights inside the cabin were a cold white, piercing through the dense rain. Emergency teams, armed and prepared for a crisis or a hijacking, surrounded the craft. No movement could be seen through the small cabin windows. When the main door was forced open, a wave of warm air smelling of fresh coffee and ozone hit the officers. But what they found inside would stare in the secret files of aviation forever. The interior of the plane was immaculate. On the folding trays sat 120 cups of coffee, with steam still rising from them. In-flight magazines were left open, halfway mobile phones were sitting on seats, and in some plates the food looked barely touched. Everything suggested that just seconds before, there were people there, going about their journey. However, the plane was hollow. In the cockpit, the seats were empty, and the control knobs were moving on their own, guided by the autopilot, even though it should have been deactivated upon landing. When investigators checked the luggage, they discovered something even more bizarre. The clothes inside the suitcases were warm too, the touch as if recently worn, but all passports and ID cards had vanished completely. What happened over the Atlantic? The black box of Flight 812 was recovered, but instead of coordinates and conversations, the tape contained only a crystalline sound of repeating in an infinite loop. There were no signs of a struggle, no drop in pressure, and no evidence of an explosion. Some say the flight entered a temporal pocket, a place where time flows differently, and the passengers were extracted by a force beyond our understanding. Others believe it was a failed military experiment in molecular teleportation. Today, the plane sits in a sealed hangar. Witnesses say that on rainy nights, if you look toward Hangar 7, you can still see the cabin lights flickering, even though the electrical system was removed years ago. Flight Bahia landed, but its passengers are still flying somewhere between worlds.